Hello everyone, Hyper here, and in today's video I wanted to briefly reflect on Tier 25, the Eternal Palace, and with the Race to World First concluding with Method coming out on top, there's quite a few things that there's to talk about, so I'll just jump straight into this video. First of all, I wanted to briefly talk about the implications of all the top guilds actually streaming their race. This was by far my favorite race to follow, just because of the sheer amount of guilds that were participating and streaming. We saw most of the top guilds, Method, Limit, Pieces, Exorcist, the Asian guilds, JTH, AFKR. So we saw a lot of different regions, a lot of different guilds, a lot of different perspectives, and it was very awesome to see how they approach rating and mythic progression. So streaming the world first race obviously does have some implications to it, because in the past, as recently as last year, Method was the only top guild who was streaming it. And now all these other guilds have joined, and we're able to see their perspectives as well. So Method started streaming their race and their progress back in Uldir. So we've had 2 full tiers, and a COS to a lesser extent, where we actually saw the top guild stream their prog. And this was great news for all the other guilds, but it was not as beneficial for Method, obviously, because if you're a guild who is not Method in those previous tiers, you were essentially able to gather information as far as their strategy, their current progress, all these different things from the Method stream. But now with these guilds also joining in the streaming scene, the table is kind of flipped, because now all guilds are able to essentially strategy snipe each other unless they are the first guild on the boss. So that was interesting to see, because the strategies that guilds use actually ended up being kind of similar at certain points in the fight. So there was a lot less overall strategy sniping than I thought there would be, and more of, okay, this guild does the intermission really well, or this guild deals with this one ad really well, or they just took little parts of different guild strategies if they were all progging the same boss and kind of incorporating it to their own idea of how this boss should be played. So overall the strategies varied quite heavily from boss to boss, but you could see little pieces of each guild strategy that was kind of taken from somewhere else and incorporated into their own. And that was very cool to see how top guilds actually managed to take information from other guilds and incorporate it into their own play. Because obviously this is something that you need to be able to do in the current scene of raiding, or in the current raiding climate where everyone is actually streaming. And one of the guilds who is notoriously good at this is obviously Pieces. Pieces in this race was not really pioneering the strategies, but they were very good at taking strategies that already existed from Method or Limit, since they were kind of in that third place spot with a few other guilds, and they were able to adapt that strategy to their comp and execute it extremely well. So that was very cool to see from Pieces. Hopefully in the future they will be a little more up there with Limit and Method as far as pioneering the strategies. But for a guild who doesn't really go as hard as Limit and Method, it was awesome to see how well they were able to take those strategies and execute them. So as far as the race goes, first 3 bosses I thought were really good. The very first boss was probably the hardest out of the first 3, as long as you were using the correct strategy on each of them. But the first 3 bosses don't really have any impact on the race. All the guilds killed the first 3 bosses within an hour. Blackwater Behemoth had some kind of bugs and just things that you expect to go wrong whenever you're underwater. But other than that, the first 3 bosses were cool. Then we move on to Lady Ashvane, which was actually the first real boss in the raid. This was a DPS check. This was a boss where you had to execute your strategy very well in order to kill it. And day 1, we saw that most of the guilds who were trying to kill this boss, mostly the NA guilds, were just simply using the 2-tank strategy and just trying to do the whole phase with only 2 tanks. Then day 2 comes, EU gets their raid opening, and they come up with the 3-tank strategy and are able to actually kill the boss. And I'm pretty sure the US guilds also started doing the 3-tank strategy day 2 prior to the EU guilds killing it. But this was one of those bosses that was a very good kind of first real boss to the raid. So the top guilds killed it in probably between 30 to 50 pulls on this fight, which is quite reasonable, especially considering that a lot of those pulls ended up being with a 2-tank strategy that's actually ended up being a lot more difficult to execute than the 3-tank. But then we move on to Orgozoa, and this was, again, a fight where you could approach it either with a 2-tank strategy or a 3-tank strategy. I believe most of the top guilds killed it with the 2-tank strat, but there were a few who actually ended up 3-tanking it, just because it made some of the ad placement easier, and it changed up some of the timings, especially for the 2 minutes cooldown classes. But this was one of the bosses that actually Limit killed first. So Ashvane was killed first by Method, and Orgozoa was killed first by Limit. And that was mostly because Orgozoa ended up getting hotfixed while Method were done raiding and Limit were kind of still pulling the boss. And after the boss got hotfixed, they killed it within, I believe, about 10 pulls. So Orgozoa again, for Method, it took 58 pulls or 58 wipes. I don't have the numbers here for Limit, but that is a decent up in difficulty. And again, considering that they had to hotfix the boss since it was a little bit too difficult, most of those pulls were spent while the boss was not yet hotfixed. Then we go on to Queen's Court. So this, for Limit, I believe took around 30 pulls. For Method, it took 17 pulls. So for Queen's Court, it was not a tremendously difficult fight, and it benefited a lot from having the right classes in the raid. So Method doubled down on the Shadow Priest stacking, while Limit had more Warlocks. And obviously Shadow Priest ended up being slightly better on this fight, judging by the pull count here. But most notably, this boss was to some extent easier to do on the first week, actually just the first 2 or 3 days that guilds got to it, because the charge mechanic that you typically need to soak was actually just dodged. You could like life grip people out of it, or you could blink it, you could teleport it. Any kind of displace ability would completely mitigate that ability, that mechanic of the boss. So this allowed for people to do more DPS. And this boss had probably one of the tightest damage checks that I can remember in recent history on bosses that are not either the last boss or second to last boss. So Queen's Court, I believe both guilds actually hit Enrage on it whenever they killed it, and just ended up either kiting the bosses around or killing one of the bosses and just having to deal with the other one for those last 15 seconds. But I believe the Queen's Court would have taken a significantly more pulls if the charge mechanic was working as intended from day one, where you had to split the damage or you had to immune it. Otherwise, your tank or whoever was in melee would actually just end up taking that damage. Because that would force all your raid to kind of help out with these soaks, and that obviously reduces your overall DPS. And since the Enrage on this fight was so tightly tuned that with the week 1 gear, any loss in DPS would mean that you needed to play the fight a lot better in different places and min-max it a little bit better to prevent hitting that Enrage. And obviously this was also one of the fights where Disc Priest and Holy Paladins shined, and throughout this entire raid, actually, both those classes ended up being insanely good. Starting from Lady Ashvane, I believe on all of the bosses, those 2 classes were just absolutely nuts, and are definitely the MVPs of this tier. So then moving on to Za'qul. Za'qul, from the people I've talked to who have killed it say that this was probably one of the best penultimate bosses that has been made either in recent history or some even say ever. So Za'qul took method 169 pulls, and I believe that was a little bit higher for limit. It was 180 something if I remember correctly. So Za'qul had, first of all, a kind of easy phase 1 as long as you figured it out. The phase 2, where you had to actually send people down and start dealing with the mythic ad, was tuned fairly well, where there was a pretty tight damage check, but it was doable with week 1 gear. Then the last phase was obviously a hard damage check because you needed to beat the third psychotic split. Za'qul was one of the bosses where we also started to seeing some comp differences, with Limit initially having the 4 fire mages, 3 rogues, double fury warrior, so a little bit more melee heavy and cleave heavy, and then Method having the 2 rogues. Actually no, Method had 3 rogues, and they had 3 fire mages and 3 shadow priests, with Limit only running 1 shadow priest. So Limit initially had 3 rogues in as well, but then Trill was not able to make it the day they actually killed it because he had a PvP tournament going on, and they ended up sending down a hunter, if I remember correctly, to help out with that mythic ad along with the rogues. So Method went for a little bit more caster heavy comp, Limit going for a little bit more melee heavy, but overall the comps were very similar. And this was also one of the bosses where the strategy ended up working out the strategy ended up being very interesting in the fact that it was not a traditional 2 tank, 3 to 4 heal, and then the rest DPS. You were actually 1 tanking this boss. And this is something that I believe Limit started doing, with having that tether actually go on their Demon Hunter, and then every time the tether got reapplied, their Demon Hunter needed to stand on top of the tank to get that tether. And then the Demon Hunter, since they have so much leech, they were essentially able to self-heal through that. And then at points in the fight where they were taking different damage, external damage from explosions or whatnot, they were also getting a little bit of help from the healers. But this was a very interesting fight to watch, because of how tightly this fight was tuned. So our previous penultimate boss was Blockades, and that was probably one of the worst bosses since week 1 it was extremely easy to do just because of how bugged it was. And then every week following that, the boss just got more and more and more difficult because they kept changing it from week to week. Za'qul is one of those fights that just off the board, they added it to the game, it was tested, and then from the first moment the guilds got to it, this boss was tuned basically perfectly. There were a few bugs that do still exist, mainly from going down to the Delirium realm, and sometimes you end up going down and being instantly hit by a tentacle and you just come back up instantly. This was supposedly fixed week 2, but it was actually not fixed week 2, and this bug still exists. And then also, in the Delirium realm where you do extra damage, the tentacles would not hit the players whenever Method and Limit were progging on it, along with pieces. However, they hotfixed that now to actually have to dodge those tentacles in the Delirium realm as well. So that's not a huge change, especially even if that was the case for the week 1 whenever Limit and Method were on it. I don't believe it would have changed too much, because down there you have 2 melee DPS and then your Shadow Priest. Your Shadow Priest at that point has so much haste that they're essentially able to constantly move whenever they want to, and it wouldn't be too difficult to dodge all those tentacles. And we saw this on the Reclear as well, whenever I believe Method one-shot it on the Reclear, and that was after the hotfixes. So Za'qul, probably one of the best penultimate bosses that we've had in recent history. It does reward class stacking to some degree, but we saw quite a few different classes being on this fight. We saw hunters, we saw mages being favored, saw warlocks, rogues obviously for dealing with that ad. As far as healers go, again, it was the double holy paladin, double disc priest, and healer diversity hasn't been great this tier, but that was, I believe, mostly because of how tightly most of these bosses were tuned. And that was something that we've been asking for since BOD. In BOD, none of the bosses seemed like they had a significant damage check. You could, up to Jaina, that's an important point to mention. But up to Jaina, none of the bosses had a significant damage check. As long as you were able to survive and execute the fight correctly, you could go on doing the fight for basically as long as you wanted to. This raid was a very different story in that almost all of the fights had some sort of important damage check. Starting with Lady Ashvane, if you got the third shield on Lady Ashvane, or the fourth shield, then the fight was basically over. And that was the boss's soft enrage, essentially. Orgozoa, at some point in the last phase, you would just have so much damage going out from everyone having the debuff that you would just wipe to damage. And phase 1, whenever you got to the 4-minute-ish mark on phase 1, it was a very good indicator because the healers were doing like 80, 85, 90k HPS while still doing DPS to the boss. So killing the boss in phase 2 before the damage ramped too high was super important. Queen's Court, obviously, both guilds that killed it actually hit Enrage. Za'qul, the DPS or the soft enrage on this fight, you could almost consider it a hard enrage, was the third psychotic split in the last phase. If you got that split, then you were essentially wiping. And then Azshara obviously had her own enrage, but I'm just going to talk about that separately. So then moving on to Queen Azshara. So Limit was the first guild to get to this boss, and they spent the first 50 to 100 pulls figuring out the first phase, intermission, second phase to some degree, second intermission. During this time, Method did their splits since, or they killed Za'qul, and then they just ended up like farming gear because they were just watching Limit, and this is where streaming becomes so important. Method was able to gather all this information while Limit was pulling the boss, and coming to this boss with essentially weak auras mostly done. I believe the only important weak aura that was not completed at this point was the soak assignments, but I know Naga said that he stayed up until like 6 a.m. working on that, so I believe by the reset they actually had it. But Method were essentially able to come into Queen Azshara with all this information about how to do phase 1, how to do the intermission, and they just had to execute that. And they essentially just had to think about how to do the later phases. Phase 3, which ended up being the hardest phase of the fight, and phase 4. This was also the fight where we saw the most important split in strategy, and as far as I know, how to approach the boss. So Method ended up going with 2 healers and using Bloodlust in the last phase, whereas Limit went with a 3 healer comp and using Bloodlust in phase 2, I believe. So those are 2 very different strategies, and as we saw, both of them allowed you to kill the boss. Method killed it with their own strategy. Limit, I believe 5 or 6 hours later, killed it with their own strategy without changing anything. So both those strategies were viable, but I believe the Method's strategy actually allowed the boss to be killed in less pulls because of how the last phase ended up working out. So the Method guys were very adamant that 2 healing the last phase would not be that big of a deal, and it's actually very doable, which ended up being the case, because most of the damage in the last phase just comes from either avoidable damage in form of the eye beams that are one shot, so if you get hit anyway, you're just dead, damage from the puddles that spawn on the ranged, and damage from the console. Now, damage from the console is the biggest factor here. And with the 2 healer strategy, you obviously have way less raid cooldowns and healing cooldowns to work with. So it was important that they played the other phases perfectly to have battle reses and have their cooldowns perfectly timed out to be able to deal with those console explosions in the last phase. But since they're holding their bloodlust until their last phase, they're able to kill that boss from the 50% to the 0% burn in about 2.5 minutes. So I was watching August stream the other day when they killed it, and he was looking at their logs, and I believe it was actually exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds. That was the last phase. And obviously that is a huge factor whenever you have a phase that essentially has a soft enrage, just because the damage ramp, you constantly have to deal with the words, you constantly have to, or every 40 seconds, you have to deal with the console, and only having to do those 2 consoles actually made a huge difference to the fight to them. And the last point here about meta strategy is that lusting in the last phase heavily favors 2-minute classes. So your 2-minute classes, your hunters, your red paladins, your mages, everyone else that has 2-minute cooldowns will carry the last phase. Whereas your 3-minute classes will carry your phase 3. So their strategy ended up taking cooldown timing into consideration, I believe, a lot more than Limits did. So now talking about Limit strategy, they obviously 3-healed it, and they lusted in phase 3. Because the phase 3 damage check, or the phase 2 damage check, to be more precise, where you had to go from phase 2 to phase 3 before spawning that spider ad. And on Meta stream, you actually see this damage check. They have a big weak aura that counts down on their stream, or on their screen. And I believe they only beat it by about 1 or 2 seconds. With Limit strategy, since you're bloodlusting and you're using 1 extra healer, you're able to make the damage check a little more easily. But without that bloodlust in the phase 2, you might be missing the damage check. So it kind of forces your hand to use bloodlust in phase 2. However, with this strategy, you ended up being more consistent at getting to phase 3. However, once you got to phase 3, this is really where the issues started popping up for Limit. Even with the strategy that favors your earlier phases and should, in theory, allow you to get to phase 4 more easily, they ended up losing a lot more people in phase 3. And then once they got to phase 4, obviously if you're down battle reses, or if you're down 1 or 2 people, since you're using 1 less DPS, and you're also not bloodlusting this phase, you end up being in this phase for a long, long time. So you have to deal with 3 whole consoles. You need to allocate cooldowns for that. Obviously, people will start dying just because they get the damage buff, and whenever that times out, you just drop dead. So if you don't have B resist for that, that is a huge damage loss, and it will make the boss fight a lot more difficult in that last phase. And we saw this on their kill. On their kill, only 2 people survived, whereas if you look at Method's kill, I believe the only people who were dead were the people who got the damage buff and ended up just getting 1 shot whenever that expired. So with Limit strategy, it favors the phase 3 and phase 2, phase 3 a lot better, I believe, just because you're able to get through that a little bit more easily. Phase 3 is obviously one of the higher damage portions of the fight, and having 3 healers for that makes it significantly easier. But that phase 4 ends up being a lot more difficult if you have less damage. So overall, this race was actually super fun to follow, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, kind of breaking down a little bit how this race turned out, what factored in, who won the race. And there's a lot to be said for coming up with a strategy and sticking to it and proving that it was a viable strategy. And of course, I'm talking about the Limit guys doing the 3 healing strat and Method guys doing the 2 healing strat, where a lot of people, including myself, were skeptical about them being able to 2 heal that last phase. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and sub to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you guys on the next one. Goodbye.